10. Catholicism reformed and reorganized. The Catholic movement corresponding to the rise of Protestantism is known as the Catholic Reformation or the Counter Reformation. Catholics have usually preferred the former term, and Protestants have usually preferred the latter, but both are applicable. On the one hand, the Catholic Church underwent a genuine reform, which might have worked itself out in one way or another, even if the stimulus of revolutionary Protestantism had been absent. On the other hand, the character of the reform, the measures adopted, and the new sense of urgency became an explicit response to the Protestant challenge. And certainly also, there was a good deal of purely counter activity aimed at the elimination of Protestantism as such. The demand for reform was as old as the abuses against which it was directed. Characteristically, it had expressed itself in the demand for a general or ecumenical church council. The conciliar movement, defeated 207b by the popes about 1450, showed signs of revival after 1500. The Lutheran upheaval thus provoked new calls for a general council of the church, and we have seen how Charles Fuff, in the interests of German unity, sought to persuade the Pope to assemble an adequately empowered council, which might remove some of the abuses in the church and take away the grounds upon which many Germans were turning to Lutheranism. But meanwhile, the King of France found reason to favor the Pope and to oppose the Emperor. The French King Francis I, 1547, could support the Pope because he had obtained from the papacy what he wanted, namely control over the Gallican Church, as acquired in the Concordat of Bologna of 1516. And he had reason to oppose Charles V, because the Habsburgs ruled not only in Germany, but also in the Netherlands, Spain, and much of Italy, thus encircling France and threatening Europe with what contemporaries called universal monarchy. Francis I therefore actively encouraged the Protestants of Germany as a means of maintaining dissension there, and used his influence at Rome against the calling of a council by which the troubles of the Catholic world might be relieved. The call for Reform 97. Gradually, there arose a party of reforming cardinals who concluded that the need for reform was so urgent that all dangers of a council must be risked. Pope Paul III thus summoned a council to meet in 1537, but the wars between France and the Empire forced its abandonment. Finally, in 1545, a council assembled and began deliberations at Trent on the Alpine borders of Germany and Italy. The Council of Trent, which shaped the destiny of modern Catholicism, sat at irregular intervals for almost 20 years. It was not until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s that some of the main decisions made at Trent were substantially modified. The Council of Trent 218, the council was beset by pressing political difficulties, which seemed to show that under troubled conditions, an international council was no longer a suitable means of regulating Catholic affairs. Significantly, it was not well attended. Whereas earlier councils of the church had assembled as many as 500 prelates, the attendance at Trent was never nearly so great. It sometimes fell as low as 20 or 30, and the important decree on justification, the prime issue raised by Luther, and one on which some good Catholics had until then believed a compromise to be possible, was passed at a session where only 60 prelates were present. Even with the small attendance, the old conciliar issue was raised. A party of bishops believed that the bishops of the Catholic Church, when assembled in council from all parts of the Catholic world, collectively constituted an authority superior to that of the Pope. To stave off this episcopal movement was one of the chief duties of the cardinal legates deputed by the Pope to preside over the sessions. The popes managed successfully to resist the idea of limiting the papal power. In the end, they triumphed through a final ruling voted by the council that no act of the council should be valid unless accepted by the Holy See. It is possible that had the conciliar theory won out, the Catholic Church might have become as disunited in modern times as the Protestant. It was clear at Trent that the various bishops tended to see matters in a national way, in the light of their own problems at home, and to be frequently under strong influence from their respective secular monarchs. In any case, the papal party prevailed, which is to say that the centralizing element, not the national, triumphed. The Council of Trent thus preserved the papacy as a unifying center for the Catholic Church, and helped prevent the very real threat of its dissolution into state churches. Preserving papal authority. Questions of national politics and of church politics apart, the Council of Trent addressed itself to two kinds of labors, to a statement of Catholic doctrine and to a reform of abuses in the church. When the council began 2919 to meet in 1545, the Protestant movement had already gone so far that any reconciliation was probably impossible. Protestants, especially Calvinists, simply did not wish to belong to the Church of Rome under any conditions. In any case, the Council of Trent made no concessions. The Council of Trent, defining Catholic doctrine, it declared that justification or salvation by God's grace came to humans through their works and faith combined. It enumerated and defined the 7 sacraments, which were held to be vehicles of grace independent of the spiritual state of those who received them. The priesthood was declared to be a special estate set apart from the laity by the sacrament of holy orders. The procedures of the confessional and of absolution were clarified. Transubstantiation was reaffirmed. As sources of Catholic faith, the Council put Scripture and tradition on an equal footing. It thus rejected the Protestant claim to find true faith in the Bible alone and reasserted the validity of Church Development 98 since New Testament times. The Vulgate, a translation of the Bible into Latin by St. Jerome in the 4th century, was declared to be the only version on which authoritative teaching could be based. The right of individuals to believe that their own interpretation of Scripture was more true than that of church authorities' private judgment was denied. Latin, as against the national languages, was prescribed as the language of religious worship, a requirement that would continue to shape Catholic liturgy until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Celibacy of the clergy was maintained, and monasticism was upheld. The existence of purgatory was reaffirmed. The theory and correct practice of indulgences were restated. The veneration of saints, the cult of the Virgin, and the use of images, relics, and pilgrimages were approved as spiritually useful and pious actions. It was easier for a council to define doctrines than to reform abuses, since the latter consisted in the rooted habits of people's lives. The Council of Trent decreed, however, a drastic reform of the monastic 220 orders. It acted against the abuse of indulgences while upholding the principle. It ruled that bishops should reside habitually in their dioceses, attend more carefully to their proper duties, and exercise more administrative control over clergy in their own dioceses. The abuse by which one man had held numerous church offices at the same time, pluralism, was checked, and steps were taken to assure that church officials should be competent. To provide an educated clergy, the council ordered that a seminary should be set up in each diocese for the training of priests. The New Catholicism, as laws in general have little force unless sustained by shared opinions. So the reform decrees of the Council of Trent would have remained ineffectual had not a renewed sense of religious seriousness been growing at the same time. Herein lay the inner force of the Catholic reform. In Italy, as the Renaissance became more undeniably pagan, and as the sack of Rome in 1527 showed that even many Catholics had lost respect for the Roman clergy, the voices of moralists began to be heeded. The line of Renaissance popes was succeeded by a line of reforming popes, of whom the first was Paul III, 1534 to 1549. The reforming popes insisted on the primacy of the papal office, but they regarded this office, unlike their predecessors, as a moral and religious force. In many dioceses, the bishops began on their own initiative to be stricter. The new Catholic religious sense, more than the Protestant, centered in a reverence for the sacraments and a mystical awe for the Church itself as a divine institution. Both men and women founded many new religious orders, of which the Jesuits became the most famous. Others were the Oratorians for men and the Ursulines for women. The new orders dedicated themselves to a variety of educational and philanthropic activities. Missionary fervor for a long time was more characteristic of Catholics than of Protestants. It reached into Asia and the Americas, and in Europe expressed itself as an intense desire for the reconversion of Protestants. It showed itself, too, in missions among the poor, as in the work of St. Vincent de Paul among the human wreckage of Paris, for which the established Protestant churches 221 failed to produce anything comparable. In America, as colonies developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Protestant clergy tended to take the European settlers' hostile view of the Indians, while the Catholic clergy labored to convert and protect them. And the Catholic Church generally worked to mitigate the brutal treatment of enslaved Africans, to which the pastors in English and Dutch colonies, perhaps because they were more dependent upon the laity, remained largely indifferent. Catholic religious renewal. 99 St. Ignatius Loyola's religious inspiration is portrayed in this painting by Peter Paul Rubens, whose work often represented the religious and political leaders of Catholic countries. We have seen how in Spain, where the Renaissance had never taken much hold, the very life of the country was connected to a kind of ongoing Christian crusade. It was in Spain that much of the new Catholic feeling first developed, and it was Spain that now generated a new surge of 222 Catholic missionary activity. Spanish writers provided the most influential 16th century accounts of Catholic mysticism, including Teresa of Avila's famous descriptions of her encounters with Christ. Spain was also the home country of St. Ignatius Loyola, 1491 to 1556. A soldier in youth, he too, like Luther and Calvin, had a religious experience or conversion, which occurred in 1521, before he had heard of Luther and while Calvin was still a boy. Loyola resolved to become a soldier of the Church, a militant crusader for the Pope and the Holy See. On this principle, he established the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. Authorized by Pope Paul III in 1540, the Jesuits constituted a monastic order of a new type, less attached to the cloister, more directed toward active participation in the affairs of the world. Only men of proven strength of character and intellectual force were admitted. Each Jesuit had to undergo an arduous mystical training set forth by Loyola in his spiritual exercises. The order was ruled by an iron discipline, which required each member to see in his immediate superior the infallibility of the Holy 100 Church. As Loyola explained in his spiritual exercises, if the Church teaches to see something as black, even when the eye sees it as white, the mind must believe it to be black. The Jesuits. For 200 years, the Jesuits were the most famous schoolmasters of Catholic Europe, eventually conducting some 500 schools for boys of the upper and middle classes. These schools taught the Catholic faith, but they also taught the principles of gentlemanly deportment. Their teaching of dancing and dramatics became a scandal to more puritanical Catholics, and they carried over the Renaissance and humanist idea of the Latin classics as the main substance of adolescent education. The Jesuits made a specialty of work among the ruling classes. They became confessors to kings and hence involved in political intrigue. In an age when Protestants subordinated an organized church either to the state or 223 to an individual conscience, and when even Catholics frequently thought of the church within a national framework, the Jesuits seemed almost to worship the church itself as a divine institution that must remain internationally organized and governed by the Roman pontiff. All full-fledged Jesuits took a special vow of obedience to the Pope. Jesuits in the later sessions of the Council of Trent fought obstinately and successfully to uphold the position of Rome against that of the national bishops. By 1560, the Catholic Church, renewed by a deepening of its religious life and by an uncompromising restatement of its dogmas and discipline, had devised also the practical machinery for a counteroffensive against Protestantism. The Jesuits acted as an international missionary force. They recruited members from all countries, including those in which the governments had turned Protestant. English Catholics, for example, trained as Jesuits on the continent, returned to England to attempt to overthrow the heretic usurper, Elizabeth, seeing in the universal church a higher cause than national independence in religion. Jesuits poured also into the most hotly disputed regions where the religious issue still swayed in the balance: France, Germany, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary. As after every great revolution, many people moved from an initial burst of Protestantism toward a revived interest in the old religious order, like especially as the more crying evils within the Catholic Church were corrected. The Jesuits reconverted many who thus hesitated. The more recalcitrant religious dissidents were repressed everywhere by new kinds of social control. All countries censored books. Protestant authorities labored to keep papist works from the eyes of the faithful, and Catholic authorities took the same pains to suppress all knowledge of heretical authors and texts. All bishops, Anglican, Lutheran, and Catholic, regulated reading matter within their dioceses. In the Catholic world, with the trend toward centralization under the Pope, a special importance attached to the list published by the Bishop of Rome, the Papal Index of Prohibited Books. Only with special permission granted to reliable persons for special study could Catholics read books listed on the index, which was not abandoned until the 1960s. 224, all countries, Protestant and Catholic, also set up judicial and police machinery to enforce conformity to the accepted church. In England, for example, Elizabeth established the High Commission to bring recusants into the Church of England. All bishops, Protestant and Catholic, likewise possessed machinery of enforcement in their episcopal courts. But no court made itself so dreaded as the Inquisition. In reality, two distinct organizations went under this name, the word itself being simply an old term of the Roman law, signifying a court of inquest or inquiry. One was the Spanish Inquisition, established originally about 1480 to ferret out Jewish and Muslim survivals in Spain. It was then introduced into all countries ruled by the Spanish crown and employed against Protestantism, particularly in the Spanish Netherlands, which was an important center of Calvinism. The other was the 101 Roman or Papal Inquisition, established at Rome in 1542 under a permanent committee of cardinals called the Holy Office. Both the Spanish and the Roman Inquisitions employed torture, for heresy was regarded as the supreme crime, and all persons charged with crime could be tortured, in civil as well as ecclesiastical courts under the existing laws. In the use of torture, as in the imposition of the harshest sentence, burning alive, the Roman Inquisition was less severe than the Spanish. The Roman Inquisition, in principle, offered a court to protect purity of faith in all parts of the Catholic world. But the national resistance of Catholic countries proved too strong. Few Catholics wished the agents of Rome inquiring locally into their opinions, and the Roman Inquisition never functioned for any length of time outside of Italy. Enforcing religious conformity in the machinery of enforcing religious belief, however, no engine was be so powerful as the apparatus of state. Where Protestants won control of government, people became Protestant. Where Catholics retained control of governments, Protestants became in time small minorities. And it was in the clash of governments, which is to say in war, 225 for about a century after 1560, that the fate of European religion was worked out. In 1560, the strongest powers of Europe, Spain, France, Austria, were all officially Catholic. The Protestant states were all small or at most middle-sized. The Lutheran states of Germany, like all German states, were individually of little weight. The Scandinavian monarchies were far away. England, the most considerable of Protestant kingdoms, was a country of only 4 million people, with an independent and hostile Scotland to the north, and with no sign of colonial empire yet in existence. In the precedence of monarchs, as arranged in the earlier part of the century, the King of England ranked just below the King of Portugal, and next above the King of Sicily. Clearly, had a great combined Catholic crusade ever developed, Protestantism could have been wiped out. Yet such a crusade, partially launched on various fronts by the King of Spain, never succeeded. Religious divisions became a permanent reality in European culture, contributing eventually, like Renaissance humanism and the new European monarchies, to a gradual secularization of modern societies. And in later, More, more secular times, the idea and practice of religious tolerance would develop as a stabilizing solution for the intractable conflicts that long threatened the lives of individual believers, as well as the survival of entire religious communities. Suggested further readings can be found in the ebook on Connect or online at www.mhg.com/Kramer12e. One bulls, so called from the Latin word for their seal, are known by their first one or two Latin words, which in this case mean one holy church. A bull, while the most solemn form of papal edict, does not as such embody a dogma, and it is not Catholic practice today to affirm this policy of Boniface VIII. The Jews who left Spain, the Sephardic Jews, went to North Africa and the Middle East, and in smaller numbers to the Dutch Netherlands, and even to southwestern France, one of the exceptions noted above. Those who left England 2 centuries earlier generally went to Germany, the great center of Ashkenazic Jewry in the Middle Ages. Driven from Germany in the 14th century, they concentrated in Poland, which remained a great center of European Jews until the Nazi massacres of the 1940s. 3. The word Protestant arose as an incident in the struggle, at first denoting certain Lutherans who drew up a formal protest against an action of the Diet of the Empire in 1529. Only very gradually did the various groups of anti-Roman reformers think of themselves as 226 collectively Protestant.